Blood in the Fields, Preface. Light has a special quality in Salinas. It is one of the few farm towns in California that isn't shrouded in a constant dusty smog. And in Salinas, the coastal fog and clouds are always playing tricks, so its mountaintops and crop rows glisten under ribbons of soft shadows and fiery sunlight. This place where I spend my working days is a contradiction of rural serenity and jagged sorrow. And I can say with honesty that it tears my heart in two. There is so much I admire here, courageous people and a toughness born from decades of labor strikes and standing up to injustice. That is another story I hope to tell someday, but it isn't the story I am telling here. This is the story of a great tragedy befalling our nation, of the constant waste of young lives over a shallow and manipulative ideology that gangsters have come to call the cause. My aim is to open a window into this world, not to mock it or glamorize it or exploit it, but to show it so we can understand it. As I write these words, it's the morning after 8 people were shot in Salinas, 3 fatally, capping 2 weeks in which 9 people were killed by warring gang members, and 1 more was felled by a torrent of bullets from 9 police officers. This month's battles are over control of drug sales in Salinas' Chinatown. Thanks to another round of law enforcement crackdowns on its leadership, the Nuestra Familia recently lost control of its most lucrative heroin and meth market, and now its rival, the Mexican Mafia, is trying to take over. The battles played out in this rural paradise, as many describe Monterey County, are also taking place all over the United States, where more than 1.4 million gang members lived in 2011, according to the Justice Department's most recent and likely conservative estimates. That's up from 1 million as recently as 2009. The economic forces that fuel rural gangs can be found at the intersection of the drug war, immigration policies, agriculture, and poverty. How do we as a society respond? In the years leading up to writing this book, I witnessed heroism as troubling as ethical concessions in the government's effort to dismantle a seemingly impenetrable criminal organization. I concluded that our response to the problem of gangs often says more about who we are than who they are. One defense attorney, in this case that's central to this book, quoting Kurt Vonnegut, put it this way after an FBI informant took charge of the gang and its violent crimes: "We must be careful about what we pretend to be." It is a truism in law enforcement circles that the laws of unintended consequences will always come into play in operations dealing with gangs. FBI agents and police speak of cutting off the head of the snake, but quickly add that as soon as they do, underlings will hustle to fill the leftover power vacuum. There are, though, some promising approaches on the horizon. One is Ceasefire, a strategy developed not to end gangs but to lower the number of youth homicides in the city. It relies on a mix of violent crime data and a clear understanding of who the local players are and what they actually want. The most violent gang members are given a clear message by police in the community: the violence must stop. If the gangsters continue shooting, the cops warn they will bring the full force of the law upon the whole crew. But for those ready to change, community volunteers will help with job training, relocation, and other needs. It's a carrot and a stick message that actually works. At this point, I am a believer in Ceasefire and other information-driven community-based strategies. And so I return to our need to understand the logic of the Nuestra Familia and similar gangs if we are ever to put a stop to their violence. Because there is always a logic. We can't forget that, for all its tragedy, this brutal subculture is a world that for vast and complex reasons makes sense to those who inhabit it. I saw this more clearly after a winter of studies at Harvard in 2009 when Professor Ronald Heifetz told us that inside another's frame of reference there can always be things that make the irrational seem rational. Nothing could be truer in the case of Salinas and its gangs. My purpose in writing this book is a simple one. I believe the killing in the streets and the fields will not stop unless the logic of the gangster's world is known and much better understood. Only then can we begin to construct alternatives. I first entered the realm of gangs through a strip mall parking lot. I was on the north side of Salinas, this quirky town best known as the birthplace of John Steinbeck and the setting for his epic novel, East of Eden. A few young men were kicking it outside a video store dressed in red shirts and belts, one in a Nebraska Cornhuskers cap. The guy wasn't wearing that hat because he supported a Midwestern football team. It was the red that mattered. And with the white capital N in front, you'd think this apparel was custom made for Norteño gangbangers. I wondered if the sports apparel vendors understood or even cared why Northern California had this surprising epidemic of Cornhuskers fever. A half dozen Norteños, all in their teens, maybe early 20s, stood in a huddle. I sat in my car ready to drive away, but I did not turn the key. I was supposed to be making a documentary. My colleagues were pitching it to HBO, and I had a job to do. I made myself get out. Walking across rows of parking spaces in front of a chain store's giant red Target, I tried to come up with something to say that wouldn't piss them off, convinced that any words from me would inspire ridicule or more violent impulses. The guys froze when I stepped close. They stared, mad dogging. I'd seen that cold expression before on the faces of Sureño kids who once surrounded me and a co-reporter, circling us on their bicycles like an Old West roundup. I tried to stare back at these Norteños, but their empty eyes made me look away. I struggled to come up with an open plea, some way to make the absurd case that they should talk to me. "Who wants to be on HBO?" I blurted. I managed an idiot smile and waited. They cursed, and then they ran. All except the one in the Cornhuskers cap. Since that day, I regularly hung out with the man called GQ and his homies while they sold drugs, got stoned, and showed off their guns. They generously offered me snorts of crystal meth, and I very politely refused. GQ was not his actual street name, but it's what I called him, and he liked it. It dawned on me one day that a competitor of GQ's could decide to pull off a home invasion robbery the very afternoon I was lounging in his living room watching American Me. I could imagine the headline, "Shower of bullets leave 3 dead." Still, I kept going to his tidy middle-class house because he invited me. He introduced me to his wife and his friends as my producer. He told me he decided to let me film him only after he saw the piles of Chicano books and magazines in my back seat. It impressed him that I was very serious about understanding La Raza. The books were actually leftovers from the days I edited a Latino literary journal, and I was thankful for being such a slob that I hadn't cleared out the car in months. Slovenliness had provided me my entree into the Norteño underworld. GQ was a street-level gangster in his early 20s, a drug dealer, as far as I know, didn't go beyond the basics to put in work for Nuestra Familia's cause. His juvenile criminal file involved a burglary conviction punctuated by probation violations every time he was caught wearing red. His young kids were always dressed in our beautiful color, as GQ put it. Despite his loyalty, he didn't seem to be on the fast track for advancement up the ranks from Norteño to Nuestra Raza, which was a kind of tweener level of gangsters who cycle in and out of prison. And he was nowhere near the top rung of the hierarchy, Nuestra Familia, the gang's parent company, headquartered in the ultra maximum security Pelican Bay State Prison up near the Oregon border. So GQ remained a plain old street Norteño. He hadn't been locked up enough to work on the finer points of the cause. It was in jail, the California Youth Authority, and the state prisons that you were educated in discipline and war tactics. There would be time for that later. Right now, GQ enjoyed a simpler life of selling and using drugs. He sent a cut of the action up to the generals in Pelican Bay, though I don't know if he ever sent the required 25%. On a glorious blue sky day, we sat side by side in his sunny driveway. He lived in a suburbanish part of town that borders the ag fields. Salinas is the only city I know with farmland right in its middle, a lettuce metropolis, as hip-hop poet Marcus Cabrera calls it. These fields are a congruous plot of 450 acres surrounded by a hospital and jail, a trailer park, rodeo grounds, and a new middle-class housing where streets are named after Anglo saints. There's a St. Edward's Drive and a St. Albans Court. If, on your way to San Jose or San Francisco, you flew over Salinas at night, you'd see a large black diamond nested in a bed of city lights. The diamond is that farm plot, a drained lake bed that for half a century has been worked by the Higashi, Hebino, and Aikita farmeries. From the days of missionaries and ranchers who first took the land from old known natives, the central coast of California has a tradition of never straying from agriculture. Nuestra Familia, the mother of all Norteño gangs, hasn't strayed either. It's a farm town mafia with, they say, close to 1,000 murders to its name. For 3 decades, the NF has exerted powerful control over the West agriculture towns: Modesto, Stockton, Los Baños, Visalia, Santa Rosa, and Watsonville. And most of all, Salinas, the salad bowl of the world. The NF has forayed into a few sizable cities too: San Jose, San Francisco, Sacramento, and even Berkeley, where the Norte's red graffiti is sprayed across the people's walls. But its strength lies in its rural cities. There are NFers in Arizona, Nevada, and Idaho, and I've met a few up in Washington State wine country. Wherever there's agriculture, this gang seems to lurk. 30 years ago, they were derisively called Fameros by the bigger city Mexican mafia rivals from Los Angeles. Nowadays, the Northerners are called Busters by kids who don't even know the name is short for sod busters. But Norteños no longer work the fields. Gangsters like GQ are second or third generation American citizens who prefer NFL to soccer, rap over rockin' en español, English over Spanish. Though the kids involved will deny it, the battle in the streets has turned into a civil war between the assimilated and the immigrants. North versus South, El Norte contra El Sur. And there is another, more insidious front. At its highest levels in Pelican Bay, this is a struggle of power between men doing life. Men who, despite being locked in high security cells 23 hours a day, managed to call the shots over the West's multi-billion-dollar drug trade. GQ is content to help build a drug empire and is not one of the old school Norteños who romanticize their Famero origins. Conveniently ignoring Cesar Chavez's doctrine of nonviolence, the old schoolers tattoo themselves with farm workers' eagle logo to show they put in work for the cause. Their cause, not the workers. GQ is of a new generation, and though he does have a salad bowl license plate frame on his SUV, he does not revere the Chicano pride legacy of Salinas. He cares little that he lives in a city where the revered labor leader Cesar Chavez was jailed during the 1970 lettuce boycott. Fuck Cesar Chavez, GQ says. I ain't never had to work in the fields. It was still morning, but GQ lit a joint. He told me Sleepy's girlfriend was found face down, shot dead in a strawberry field. He offered this casually, sucking in the smoke. Jesus, Sleepy, that's my name for him, was his closest homie. I liked the guy. He was friendly, eager to show off his fresh tattoos. To be honest, he came across as, well, sweet. At first I wondered if Sleepy was capable of being a serious criminal beyond snorting lines and carrying a formidable piece. Old-fashioned revolvers, Sleepy taught me, were making a comeback, because unlike the semi-automatics, they don't leave shell casings behind. It was a useful lesson, but I wasn't convinced Sleepy had ever used a revolver on an enemy. As I said, I like the guy, but I've learned never to judge a gangster by niceness. Sleepy was on the run, GQ said. The cops say he's a suspect, but that ain't what went down at all. He laughed, a startling laugh, cold and hard as metal. I marveled at how capable he was of enjoying his best friend's agony. She was informing for the Salinas police, he said. Who took her out? I asked. You know. I did know. At least in a generic way. The NF kills more of its own than all of its enemies put together. He wasn't going to say more about it. GQ may have had a mouth on him, but he follows the rules. Never give names or reveal the gang's business. He turned to look at me as he took his next hit off the joint. It was a hollow, slow, deliberate stare that said, just in case you were thinking of talking to the cops. After I was introduced to the Norteños through GQ's eyes, I spent the better part of a year being schooled in much the same way an aspiring gangster would be. Little Mondo, whose story fills these pages, was my teacher. I learned how to make a knife from magazine pages and soap, what the letters in the word cause stand for, and why he once believed it was a noble thing to make war with fellow Mexican Americans. After living in the city almost all my life, I at least saw that there were layers of cities in every city, each with its own rules and language. I understood the gang graffiti. that before meant nothing. I read messages in people's garments, saw their allegiance in a tiny tattoo of a strawberry or artichoke behind an ear. I had learned the language of the gang, and it was knowledge that would haunt me ever after. At times, I didn't want to know so much. Didn't want to see the red clothes and cars every time I pulled over at Central Valley Rest Stop. Didn't want to grasp the warning scrawled across my own neighborhood's walls. Once, with nowhere to go, after a depressing day that began with GQ and ended with a shooting in a church parking lot, I went to see my friend, Pastor Frank. Frank was formerly a Latino nerd, a software geek who, they say, made money back in the day. How he came to be a pastor in the poorest part of Salinas is a tale I had yet to hear. He balances the flash of his gunmetal gray BMW with a hand-carved wooden cross pendant and Armani glasses, sporting what looked like tiny United Farm Workers eagles on the sides. The combed back, just graying hair adds to his cool aura, old enough to be wise, hip enough to be fun. Frank used to run around after school program at his church that helped keep more than a few East Side kids out of gangs. For those souls already lost, he was a chaplain at the jail and the county's hospital emergency room, which is how he came to know so many members of the Nuestra Familia at one time. He knew the entire Salinas regiment. He never talks about their business or their choices, never judges or suggests they stop. He's there for their spiritual needs. The gangsters respect him so much that one had the courtesy to tip him off that his glasses with that UFW bird could be considered gang-related indicia by law enforcement. When they go off to state prison, as they invariably do, gangsters from both sides of the North-South war put him on their visitors list. Like me, the pastor had no clue any of this existed before he arrived here. You get to Salinas, and you have your young men like GQ and Little Mondo who think all this is normal, as if every town in America has third-generation gang families, an underground black market of guns, and a mob that rules strawberry fields and dust-covered roads on orders smuggled in coded messages from a Supermax prison 400 miles away. Then you get to know the serious gangsters, polite guys, who can carry grandma's groceries one moment and slash an enemy's throat the next. And that's when you enter a world you can't describe to your closest friends because there is no comparison, no ground on which to stand. Pastor Frank and I stood outside his church, the Gabilan Mountains towering behind him. On summer evenings when the fog clouds rolled in to hug the hilltops and circle over this great trough of a valley, the sun occasionally managed to hover above the marine layer, and on the tips of the mountains there's a glowing stripe of light that makes the whole range luminous. The sloping fields and underskirts of the hills are darkened by the shadow of evening, but the mountain's upper halves stay lit by the lingering gold of afternoon. Half is in darkness, yet half is illuminated. It's the time of day I savor here. This is God's country, I said. I'm glad you recognized it. Pastor Frank smiled. He may have been hinting to another invitation to his Sunday service, an offer I'm always resisting, but he knew what I meant was I love this place. Love it as he does, despite the pain that hovers like those clouds. One day I will ask Pastor Frank how he deals with the constant broken heart.